Gift for Gun Nuts Cyber Monday live stream event. And I'm just going to talk until I see that this is active and streaming here. Let's see. Whenever I watch these webinars, I always see the other guy. They always have two guys. And I think to myself, it's probably don't need that second guy. And then today was my first day doing one of these. And I'm like, that's why they always have a second guy in the background, clicking on things and posting links. It's very handy. Let's see. All right. And all right, we are live. So Andrew Braga, welcome to the Gift for Gun Nuts Cyber Monday live stream event. How's everything going with you?
Everything is going awesome, James. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Andrew, you're the author of The Law of Self-Defense, and you have a lot of products that people can use at lawofselfdefense.com. Would you like to tell us a bit about those?
Oh, yes. We have a ton of stuff. We have our book, of course, and softcover and hardcover and Kindle version. We have our live classes we teach all over the country. We have the equivalent of that live class in DVD and online form that can be streamed to people's desktops if they don't have me coming to their location anytime soon. We have state-specific DVDs for all 50 states with self-defense law based on their statutes, court decisions, jury instructions. We have other stuff about self-defense insurance programs. We have level 2 classes that we teach that are rather more technical, but we cover self-defense law in just about every way imaginable.
Great. And we talked on the podcast a bit about, why that was so important, but maybe for the folks watching today, they have family members that are carrying for self-defense. Why do they need to, they're the good guys. So why do they have to pay so much attention to the law and, and all the information that you have out there?
Yeah, unfortunately, the law is brutally unforgiving is the problem. Many people are out there with a concealed carry permit. And by the way, I put myself in the same bucket. This is how I started. I went out, took a concealed carry class, got a pistol, got a holster, put it on my hip, went out in public. And I was a brand new spanking lawyer. I thought I knew what I needed to know about the law of self-defense. It wasn't until people started asking me questions as a lawyer about it that I realized I couldn't answer their questions. I didn't know as much as I thought I did, that I started my education myself on my law of self-defense, because I can tell you they don't teach this stuff in law school. In my 3 years of law school, we spent maybe 3 minutes on this. And what we end up with is a group of people, millions of people out there with concealed carry permits, carrying guns, fully prepared to use them against a bad guy if they are threatened or their family is threatened, and they think they know what the rules of engagement are. But in fact, they generally don't. In my experience, when you teach a class on some subject, you hope that the students show up. They show up with maybe zero knowledge on that subject, and you try to get them as close to 100% knowledge as you can over the course of the class. But it's been my experience teaching thousands of people self-defense law all over the country, and not just civilians, but cops, other lawyers, judges, federal law enforcement, that most of those people don't start off at zero when they come into the class. They start off at -20. And the first thing you have to do is spend an hour or so unteaching them all the nonsense they've been taught in classes taught by other folks. Stuff they've been taught that's rumor, innuendo, myth on the internet, but has absolutely no connection to the actual law, meaning statutes, court decisions, jury instructions. And unfortunately, the reason they haven't been taught well is not that their instructors were bad people or were teaching with malice or anything like that. It's just that there's so few sources of actually good law-based information on this self-defense stuff. And unfortunately, the simple truth is that if you're involved in a physical battle, the prospects that you'll be facing a legal battle afterwards are something that you simply can't discount. It may not happen. You may get lucky. The prosecutor may give you a break, but that's not up to you. That's someone else's call. And so you need to be prepared not for what a prosecutor might do if he's feeling favorably disposed. You need to be prepared for what he can do if he's not feeling favorably disposed. And what he can do if your use of force was not strictly within the bounds of the law is potentially put you in jail for much of the rest of your life. I'm always telling people they have to keep in mind, you got a gun, you put it on your hip, you go out in public with it, and that's awesome. I'm not discouraging that at all. I've carried a gun for personal protection my entire adult life, which is going on several decades now. I encourage people to do that in a responsible way. But people also have to keep in mind that the moment you get engaged in a physical confrontation, you've just incurred two risks you weren't incurring a moment before. One of them is a risk of dying in that fight. There's no magic that says the good guy wins the gunfight, right? Well, the second is the risk of going to jail for much of the rest of your life, because that legal battle is really no less serious than the physical battle. Of course, you have to survive the physical battle or nothing else matters. But there's little point to surviving the physical battle and then spending 10 or 20 or 30 years in a prison cell afterwards. And the good news is you don't have to do that. I know a lot of times people are taught self-defense law in a way that makes it seem very kind of gray and amorphous and ambiguous and hard to understand. The truth is self-defense law is pretty straightforward. There's only 5 elements to a claim of self-defense, just like there's only 5 rules of gun safety. It's not that hard to learn. Now, the real world's complicated. The real world is gray and amorphous and uncertain boundaries. So applying those 5 elements of self-defense to a complicated real world scenario can be challenging. That's why we teach what we teach. But the truth is there's no reason not to learn this stuff to a degree that will allow you to not only be more decisive in the physical fight because you'll know what you're doing is lawful, but also make yourself hard to convict in the legal fight.
Right, and something that you said last time I talked to you is that there's no way to reduce that risk of injury or prosecution to zero. And I think a lot of people get it in their heads, well, as long as I do this, I have nothing to worry about. And it's you have to do that to minimize your risk, but there's still a risk of needing a lawyer after the fact.
Oh, you'll definitely need a lawyer. That's 100% risk. The risk I'm concerned about is not whether or not you'll need a lawyer, because you can just buy one of those. The risk I'm concerned about is stuff you don't have control over, like you're convicted of a serious felony and you go to jail for 10 or 20 years, especially if that felony involved a firearm, which in your mind you used in self-defense. But once you're convicted, that gun is simply a sentencing enhancement factor. So they add another 5 or 10 or 20 years onto your sentence because a gun was involved. So that's the risk you can never reduce to absolute zero, just like you can't reduce the risk of dying in the fight to absolute zero. With all our training and practice, what we do is we try to get that risk as close to zero as possible. That's what prudent human beings do. You get in your car, you put your seatbelt on. Doesn't mean you can't die in a car crash. Right. It just means you've reduced the risk of dying in the car crash in a responsible way that you should do. Well, the same is true of training for the physical fight and preparing yourself for the legal fight with the stuff we do at Law of Self-Defense. Now, you can get your risk of prosecution and conviction really, really close to zero if you know where the actual legal boundaries actually are and you design your self-defense strategies accordingly. Because the truth is, it's really hard for a prosecutor to convict someone who used force within the bounds of lawful self-defense. It's a very difficult challenge for them, and they don't like difficult cases. Prosecutors have conviction rates in excess of 90%, not because they bring all the hard cases to trial. It's because they bring the easy cases to trial. If you look to them like you're hard to convict, they don't want to take your case to trial because it doesn't look like an easy win. And it's not that hard to make yourself hard to convict. But by hard to convict, I mean within the bounds of the actual law, not something you read on the internet or your cop buddy down the street told you. Nobody cares about any of that. None of that has any relevance in a courtroom. All that matters in the courtroom is what are the statutory, court decision, jury instruction boundaries. If you don't know what those are, you don't know where the cliff edge is. So how could you possibly hope to stay within the legal boundaries?
So people hearing this and they want to improve their education, where's the best place for them to start? Is it to go to the website or buy the book, or where should they go first?
If they do nothing else, I would urge them to at least get the Kindle version of our book. It's less than $10, folks. And it teaches you most of what you need to know. It's an easy read. It's written in plain English. Go read our reviews on Amazon. 5-star reviews. We've had hundreds of reviews. We have a 5-star out of 5 average. And the biggest compliment we get is that the book's readily accessible. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand what we're communicating. And frankly, that's our mission here at Law of Self-Defense. I mean, I have a normal legal practice, of course, but our core mission for all of you is for us to translate all that legalese of the statutes and the court decisions and the jury instructions into plain English, so it's accessible and actionable, so you can conduct yourself in the heat of the moment within the legal boundaries because you know where they are. You're not doing a lot of complicated legal analysis in your head at the moment. You've structured your self-defense strategy prior so that you know you're within those rules. So if you get the Kindle version of our book, it's $9.99, I believe. Folks, it's just not a lot of money. Now, I would urge you to get the print version. I think it's a few dollars more, but the nice thing about getting in a print is you can use it as a textbook. You can make annotations, you can make notes to yourself, you can underline things, highlight things. And when you start doing that, you actually make the book and your knowledge acquired from the book admissible in court if you ever need it to be, because you've acted in self-defense. It becomes a piece of very robust evidence in support of your reasonable conduct in self-defense. So I do urge people to get the physical copy of the book. Now, the book's just a book. It's, I think, 300 pages long. Obviously, I'm not talking on the book. It's just printed words. So it doesn't have the kind of comprehensive coverage that our, for example, our 8-hour level 1 class does, which you can get, again, live if I'm coming to your neighborhood, or on DVD or streamed online. In fact, I think there should be a link on the page people can see. lawofselfdefense.com/Cyber Monday, one word, Cyber Monday. And we have all these products at 30 to 60% off through today, I believe, or maybe through tomorrow midnight. I forget. But I would urge folks, if they're interested, take a look. And by the way, I also want to tell folks, you buy our products, you take our classes, it's literally a zero risk proposition, because if you don't believe that you got every penny's worth of what you paid, it's 100% refund. We don't keep your money if you're not happy with what you got. So take the class, buy the book, read it. If you decide you don't like it, you just get your money back. It's no big deal.
And an 8-hour.
By the way, we've never had anyone ask for their money back ever.
That's an important. Yeah, that's an important.
Okay. I mean, absent, a DVD that was broken or something, we just send them another DVD. But no one's ever asked for their money back because they didn't believe they got adequate value for what they paid. And I've been doing this a long time, folks.
Okay. And so, I think about the 300-page book and all the information I got in there. What kind of things are we covering in the 8-hour class? It's got to be a tremendous amount of detail.
Well, in the class, what we can cover is a lot more real world examples. So real world cases of people who used force. We also cover it in much more state specific detail. So the book, by its nature, is, we don't know what state people are in when they buy the book. So it's kind of a 30,000 foot coverage of self-defense law. We cover the general principles that apply in all 50 states. And then in the back of the book, we have little tables with state specific law. But in the DVD classes, we actually get to dive into all that content in much more detail, much more depth. We illustrate all the legal principles with many more actual court cases, and we explain how the law was applied to real people in real self-defense situations. We explain how these things are argued in court so people can understand how their conduct will be viewed in a courtroom, which is remarkably different than it's viewed in our imaginations when we're thinking about what we might do in actual self-defense. And especially the state-specific content, those state-specific DVDs, and we have them for all 50 states, folks. So there's not one state that's not covered. Really goes into depth on all those legal principles, applying your state's specific statutes, court decisions, jury instructions. That is what prosecutors, what judges, what criminal defense attorneys are looking at when they're evaluating your use of self-defense. That is literally the legal boundaries by which your conduct is going to be judged if you find yourself in a courtroom.
Oh, yeah. And I've talked to a few people who have been on who've been charged after using a firearm defensively. And it's remarkable how the media and public opinion will just be so quick to convict you, and you have this version in your mind, and even though the burden's supposed to be on the state to prove it, it feels like it's on you to uh, to prove what you say happened.
Right. So the burden's on the state to convict you. The burden's not very much on the state to keep from putting you through the process. And the process is incredibly destructive. So I routinely consult on use of force cases where somebody's presented a gun or threatened somebody with a gun in what they believe is lawful self-defense. And they've gotten charged, sometimes with multiple felonies. They've retained an attorney, and that attorney calls me to consult on the case. And I'm pleased to say in almost every instance of these cases on which I consult, we get the charges dismissed. Those people don't have to go to trial. But they had to go to that pre-trial hearing where that decision was made not to go to trial. And to get to that pre-trial hearing cost them $30,000 to $50,000 to their lead counsel and more money to me for my consulting. Well, 30 to 50, I don't know about everyone watching this program, but 50 grand is a lot of money to me.
Sure.
And I'd much rather be in a position where my conduct in self-defense was so well within the legal boundaries that I simply looked so unattractive as a target for prosecution that I never got to that point, that I didn't have to spend 50 grand to find out, all right, maybe we won't prosecute you after all. And by the way, if they don't come to that decision, if they decide they're going to prosecute you after all, just multiply that 50 grand by 3 or 4 or 5. And that's the money you're going to have to come up with for a trial to keep yourself from being locked in a cage for 10 or 20 years. I don't know if you have that kind of money in your mattress, but if you don't, what typically happens, the cases I consult on, is people have to sell a business, have to sell their home, have to cash out their retirement account, have to cash out their kids' college fund. People will spend a lot of money to keep from being locked in a cage for much of the rest of their life, as they ought to do. But why not spend $9.99 on a Kindle book so you know where the legal boundaries are and you don't make yourself vulnerable to that kind of risk?
Right. And talking about spending that amount of money, it's not a gamble in the sense that if in the end it turns out you are found innocent, you don't get that money back.
No, you sure right. The money's gone forever.
Yeah. So yeah, very, very expensive proposition there.
And people need to keep in mind, as innocent as they know they were, even if they have a genuine good faith belief that they were acting in lawful self-defense, you can put them on a lie detector test and they would pass every single time. Their fate is being judged by people who don't have that personal knowledge. They weren't there when the use of force event occurred. The cops weren't there. The prosecutor wasn't there. The judge wasn't there. The jury wasn't there. None of them know what actually happened. All they know is what the evidence suggests to them happened. All the jury knows is what is being argued in front of them in court, and that may not be the whole story from the defendant's perspective. So we have to understand that the risk is not just that people will understand your perspective. They don't know your perspective. They'll never know. They can't be inside your head. All they can know is the stories that are being told in that courtroom. And I'm sorry to say it, but innocent people do go to jail. People who believe they acted in lawful self-defense, often because they were given bad information elsewhere, suddenly discover that, in fact, what they thought was a lawful use of force was actually outside the bounds of the law. And that's not a very difficult conviction for a prosecutor to get. And those people did that to themselves. They made themselves vulnerable to prosecution. And you just don't have to do that, folks. I think the most expensive product that we sell at Law Self-Defense to the general public is $200. That's our high end. And of course, now we have a Cyber Monday sale, so it's heavily discounted. But $200 is a small price to pay to make yourself hard to convict and look like a not vulnerable target that's going to have to cough up 50 grand for a retainer and maybe a couple hundred grand for a trial.
True. Okay. From time to time, we hear about prosecutors acting politically, where they don't like concealed carry, they don't like the Second Amendment, and they either they or the judge act in such a way that not sure what word to insert there, but not helpful to us. Is that, how much of a concern is that, or is that mostly fabricated by the media?
Oh, it's not fabricated, but it's not the norm. I know a lot of prosecutors, and the ones I know are overwhelmingly good public servants who are just trying to protect the community by putting bad actors, bad, violent actors, especially in prison. So folks like you and I and our wives and kids don't have to deal with those violent, bad actors. I'm a fan of prosecutors. That said, prosecutors have enormous authority and discretion. And if a bad person gets in that job, they can do a lot of damage. And politically motivated prosecutions do happen. They're not the norm by any means, but they do happen. And when they happen, they're incredibly destructive. I see plenty of prosecutions in which there's literally zero evidence inconsistent with innocence. It's impossible to get a conviction on this person. But the prosecutor brings them to trial anyway because they have political ambitions. This is why I caution people against preparing only for what a well-intentioned prosecutor will do. We have to be prepared for what a politically motivated prosecutor can do. Now, the good news is that what you need to do in self-defense to reduce your risk of conviction as close to zero as possible is exactly the same if you're dealing with a well-intentioned prosecutor as it is when you're dealing with a politically motivated prosecutor. Because assuming you have good defense counsel, the ultimate decision's made in that courtroom, and the politics don't matter in the courtroom. The prosecutor can do all the theater he wants, but your defense attorney is going to hold him to the legal standard of the law. And as long as your conduct was within the law, you can keep your risk of conviction as close to zero as possible. A good example of this is the George Zimmerman trial in Florida. George Zimmerman, and we obviously don't have time to get into the whole case, but I can tell you, having watched every minute of that trial and seen every bit of evidence in that file, he literally did nothing legally wrong. Now, he made some poor tactical decisions, but legally he did nothing wrong, and they prosecuted him anyway. For 14 months of investigation and trial, they tried to put him in prison for the rest of his life, and they couldn't do it. And the reason they couldn't do it was because his actual conduct in self-defense was within the legal boundaries, and they couldn't overcome that barrier. And of course, he had outstanding legal counsel that held the prosecutor to their standards.
Now, Florida was a stand your ground state at that time. Would that have been different had he been in another state, or was it
wouldn't have made any difference. By the way, most states are stand your ground states. 36 states are stand your ground states. So Florida is not an aberration. It's the norm.
Sure.
The aberration is the 14 states that do impose a legal duty to retreat.
Yeah. That's why
not always the states you might expect, by the way, surprisingly. For example, California is a stand your ground state. Arkansas is a duty to retreat state. Who would have thought?
No, yeah, that would have surprised me. Yeah. Spending most of my time in New Jersey, New York, I'm always cautious. So we talked about having a few $100,000 around just in case. For folks that don't have that, there's a whole bunch of insurance products out there, and we talked about this briefly last time we talked, but I think you have something new coming out.
We do. In fact, we just launched. We get so many questions on this that we just launched an entire class in DVD and online form, Self-Defense Insurance Explained, a comprehensive guide for the armed citizen. Self-defense insurance with the insurance in scare quotes, because none of these companies actually offer you insurance. But we use that phrase because we can't come up with a better phrase that kind of accurately describes what they do. Some of the companies themselves are insured for coverage of the payments they give you as part of your membership with their organization, but none of them insure you personally. So they're not really offering insurance. And by the way, they do that deliberately because if they offered insurance, they'd have to comply with all the insurance regulations in every state, and they don't want to have to do that.
Sure.
So they don't literally offer insurance, but what they do basically is they offer some form of reimbursement for your legal expenses if you're one of their members and you're charged with a criminal offense against which you raise the legal defense of self-defense. Sadly, however, not all these organizations are created equally. And we would get it's a very confusing marketplace out there. They all offer different baskets of products and services, so it's very difficult for folks to compare one to the other. It's comparing apples and oranges. And unfortunately, most people don't know enough about the legal process and how it actually works to make an informed decision about which of these products might be best suited for them. So that's why we came up with the class. We launched it I think just a couple of weeks ago at this point, and it's been enormously popular, which is very pleasing. And we're certainly hoping that it enables people to make better informed, more confident decisions about these kinds of programs, because they're certainly not all created the same. And unfortunately, it can be difficult for someone not informed on what actually matters from a legal defense perspective to make a good decision about which one to get. If any, by the way. Not everybody needs this kind of coverage. If you don't have a lot of, perhaps that's too much detail to go into in our meeting here today. But people have to make their own decision, of course, about whether or not to get any kind of insurance. That's kind of a general risk tolerance decision. But once people are interested in considering some kind of self-defense insurance program, I would really urge them to inform themselves so they don't end up sending several $100s a year to some organization that is unlikely to actually be able to help them if they're ever criminally charged in a use of force event.
Yeah, and just a brief investigation I've done into it. There's companies that reimburse you upon acquittal. There's companies that will pay up front. There's all, like you said, a whole different baskets of services, and so it is very difficult to compare them all.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables. I mean, when do they pay? How much do they pay? Under what circumstances do they pay? It's all very kind of general when you go to their websites and they describe themselves. But I can tell you, once you become enmeshed in the criminal justice process, when you need to come up with money and how much money you need to come up with gets incredibly specific really fast. It's not general anymore. And you either have that money at hand available to pay for your legal defense and everything that goes on with your legal defense. It's not just your attorney. There's all kinds of other costs. There's costs for consultants like me. There's expert witnesses. There's your own forensics you may want to have done. And these things make the difference between winning or losing the trial. They really matter. There's a huge difference between a $30,000 legal defense and a $300,000 legal defense. Not because your attorney's getting that extra money, but because that pays for all the additional resources that make the difference between winning and losing the battle. It's just like fighting a war. If the army that has more resources is the one that's more likely to win in that conflict, you want as many resources on your behalf as you can possibly have. And hopefully to be able to have those resources without having to do things like sell your home, sell your business, cash out your retirement account, and so forth. I can tell you, I just this past week, just finished another consulting assignment on another case for a client who was charged with multiple criminal charges for having momentarily, less than 3 seconds, displayed a gun in a confrontation, never even pointed it at the other person, just made them aware they had it. By the way, I have to be careful. I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to disclose the client's identity. But the point was they were able to retain me as a legal consultant on their case. We got those charges dismissed. But the only reason, this is not a person with a lot of money. This is not a person with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars set aside for legal defense, but they were a member of one of the better self-defense insurance organizations. So they sent me my check. They called me, and the lead counsel called me, say, I have a client. We'd like you to consult. This company will pay your bill. They overnight me a check, and I'm ready to start working on the case. And that person got their charges dismissed this morning. So they know they're not going to trial. They know they're not going to spend much of the rest of their life in prison because they had the resources backing them up. One of the most common stories I hear back from lead counsel I consult to is so my deliverable on these consulting cases is usually a big report, 100-page, 200-page report, a legal analysis on the likelihood that a prosecution of this individual would be productive for the prosecutor, that they'd be likely to get a conviction. And the most common response I get from lead counsel is they get one of those reports, they put it on the desk of the prosecutor, and the prosecutor's like, oh, man. Because suddenly he realizes there's a lot more resources he's going to have to fight against than he'd anticipated. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons we generally get the charges dismissed. on the merits, I want to say. I've
Sure.
yet to have a client who didn't deserve to get the charges dismissed. But the truth is that prosecutor has 40 files on his desk that he can bring to trial that are just dummy criminals that are be easy convictions that he doesn't have to put a lot of effort into winning. Our clients, he has to put a lot of effort into winning, and that discourages. That's one of the things that makes you hard to prosecute.
Sure. And I imagine on the flip side, there's lots of people out there who didn't have access to these that ended up taking plea deals or being
You
convicted
know,
because,
it's unfortunate. I get, as you can imagine, in my office, we get calls and emails many times every week from people saying, "Hey, my son was arrested for this, or my brother was convicted of that, and he was self-defense and he needs some help." And but they don't have any money. And I
yeah,
apologize, but I've got a mortgage and a wife and kids and a family to support, and I can't work for free. So I can't help those people because they don't have the resources necessary to mount a credible legal defense. If they have the resources, amazing things can happen, but you need to have them.
yeah, yeah. Right, right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And uh, what else should we know about law of self-defense or your new product here?
Well, for this show, I would just point people again to lawselfdefense.com/Cyber Monday. We have pretty much all our products there, from our least expensive book up to our most valuable level 1 core class at incredible discounts. And that's just lawselfdefense.com/Cyber Monday, one word. And if they're particularly interested in the self-defense insurance program, and we've only had this out a couple of weeks, and we've sold a ton of these things. It's just a single DVD, provides you everything you need to know about self-defense insurance. We even highlight, I think it's a handful, 5 or 6 of the most well-known self-defense insurance companies. We rank them in terms of specific criteria that we explain why certain facets are important, why others are not. I even share with you the one that I've chosen myself to protect myself and my family, if heaven forbid I ever have to use force in self-defense or in defense of my family. And they can get that at an incredible discount, DVD form, streamed online. They could be watching it tonight. Lawselfdefense.com/insurance will bring them right there.
Great. Well, thanks again for being on the show, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Anytime, James.